Hello again. This is My Spy Texas, reading some more from Leo Tolstoy's Anna Karenina, and we are in Part 4, Chapter 19. Just before this, we have heard that Vronsky has shot himself, feeling very hopeless and unworthy, and has been dragged off wounded to some other room. So chapter 19 begins like this. The mistake made by Alexei, that when preparing to see his wife, he had overlooked the possibility that her repentance might be sincere, and that he might forgive her, that she might not die. This mistake was brought home to him in all its significance 2 months after his return to Moscow. But the mistake made by him had arisen not simply from his having overlooked that contingency, but also from the fact that until the day he looked at his dying wife, he had not even known his own heart. Wow, these are some complex sentences I'm trying to read here. Okay, back to the story. At his sick wife's bedside, he had for the first time in his life given way to that feeling of warm compassion always roused in him by the suffering of others, and hitherto looked on him with shame as a harmful weakness. And pity for her, and remorse for having desired her death, and most of all the joy of forgiveness. All of this made him at once conscious, not merely of the relief of his own suffering, but of a spiritual peace he had never experienced before. So an aside is that here we see Tolstoy talking about spiritual peace, and it seems that as he's been writing this in installments over a couple of years, he is going through some of his own spiritual transformation as well, and he bestows upon Alexei some kind of transformative suffering that changes things. Okay, back to the story. He suddenly felt that the very thing that was the source of his suffering had become the source of his spiritual joy, that what had seemed insoluble while he was judging, blaming, and hating had become clear and simple when he forgave and loved. I think I'm going to read that sentence again. He suddenly felt that the very thing that was the source of his suffering had become the source of his spiritual joy, that what had seemed insoluble while he was judging, blaming, and hating had become clear and simple when he forgave and loved. He forgave his wife and pitied her for her sufferings and her remorse. He forgave Vronsky and pitied him, especially after reports reached him of his desperate action. He felt more for his own son than before, and he blamed himself now for taking too little interest in him. But for the newborn little girl he felt a special sentiment, not only of pity, but of tenderness. At first, from a feeling of compassion alone, he had been interested in this delicate little creature who was not his child, and who, cast to one side during her mother's illness, would have certainly died if he had not troubled about her, and he did not himself observe how fond he became of her. He would go into the nursery several times a day and sit there for a long while, so that the nurses, who were at first afraid of him, got quite used to his presence. Sometimes for half an hour at a time he would sit silently gazing at the saffron-red, downy, wrinkled face of the sleeping baby, watching the movements of the frowning brows and the fat little hands with clenched fingers that rubbed little eyes and nose. At such moments particularly, Alexei had a sense of perfect peace and inner harmony and saw nothing extraordinary in his position, nothing that ought to be changed. But as time went on, he saw more and more distinctly how, ever natural the position he seemed now, he would not long be allowed to remain in it. He felt that besides the blessed spiritual force controlling his soul, there was another, a brutal force as powerful or more powerful, which controlled his life, and that this force would not allow him that humble peace he longed for. He felt that everyone was looking at him with questioning amazement, that he was not understood, and that something was expected of him. And above all, he felt the instability and the unnaturalness of his relations with his wife. When the softening effect of the near approach of death had passed away, Alexei began to notice that Anna was afraid of him, ill at ease with him, and could not look him straight in the face. She seemed to be wanting, not daring, to tell him something, as though foreseeing that their present relations could not continue. He seemed to be expecting something from him. Toward the end of February, it happened that Anna's baby, who had also been named Anna, fell ill. Wow, there are so many Annas getting sick in this story. Back to the story. Alexei went into the nursery that morning, leaving orders for the doctor to be sent for. He went to his office. On finishing his work, he returned home at 4. Going into the hall, he saw a handsome footman in a braided livery and bearskin cape holding a fine white fur coat. Who's here? Well, the Princess Elizaveta Tverskaya, the groom answered, and it seemed to Alexei that he was grinning. During all this time, Alexei had noticed that his worldly acquaintances, especially women, took particular interest in him and his wife. Well, of course they're interested. It's the most bizarre setup ever. All these acquaintances, he observed, had difficulty concealing a kind of mirth, the same mirth that he had perceived in the lawyer's eyes, and just now in the eyes of the groom. Everyone seemed somehow enormously delighted, as though they had just been to a wedding. When they met him, they inquired about his wife's health with hardly disguised glee. The presence of Princess Elizabeth was unpleasant because of the memories associated with her, and also because he disliked her, and he went straight to the nursery. In front of his son, who was lying on the table with his legs on a chair, he noticed him drawing and chatting merrily away. The English governess had replaced the French one. She was sitting near the boy crocheting. She got up, curtsied, and nudged the little boy. Alexei stroked his son's hair and answered the governess's inquiries about his wife and asked what the doctor had said about the baby. The doctor said it was nothing serious and he ordered baths. But she is still in pain, listening to the baby screaming in the other room. I think it's because of the wet nurse, the Englishwoman said firmly. What makes you think so? It's just as it was at the Countess's. They gave the baby medicine, and it turned out that the baby was just hungry. The nurse had no milk. Alexei pondered, and after standing still a few seconds, he went to the other door. The baby was lying with her head thrown back, stiffening herself in the nurse's arms, and would not take the plump breast offered to her. She never ceased screaming in spite of the hushing of the wet nurse and the other nurse who was bending over her. Still no better? She is very restless, answered the nurse. Miss Edwards said that perhaps the wet nurse has no milk. I think so too. Well, then why didn't you say so? Well, who's the one to say it to? Anna is still ill. The nurse was an old servant of the family. and in her simple words there seemed to Alexei an allusion to his position. The baby screamed louder than ever, struggling and sobbing. The nurse, with a gesture of despair, went to her, took her from the wet nurse's arms, and began walking up and down, rocking her. "You must ask the doctor to examine the wet nurse." The smartly dressed and healthy-looking nurse, frightened at the idea of losing her job, muttered something to herself, and covering her bosom, smiled contemptuously at the idea of doubts being cast upon her abundance of milk. In that smile, too, Alexei saw a sneer at his position. "Luckless child," said the nurse, hushing the baby, and still walking up and down with her. Alexei sat down and with the despondent and suffering face watched the nurse walking to and fro. When the child was at last still, he had been put onto a cot, and the nurse, after smoothing the little pillow, had left her. Alexei got up and, walking awkwardly on tiptoe, approached the baby. For a minute he was still and gazed at the baby with the same despondent face. But all at once a smile which wrinkled the skin on his forehead and made his hair move came out of his face, and he went softly out of the room. In the dining room he rang the bell and told the servant who came in to send again for the doctor. He felt annoyed with his wife for not being so anxious about this delightful baby, and in his mood he had no wish to go to her. He had no wish either to see Princess Betsy. But his wife might wonder why he did not go to her as usual, and so, overcoming his disinclination, he went toward the bedroom, and he walked over the soft rug toward the door. He could not help hearing a conversation that he did not want to hear.